The lawyer reached the final page of the will and paused. By then, nearly everything had been distributed. Her grandfather's house went to his eldest son. His savings were divided among the family. His books, tools, and personal belongings had all been assigned exactly as everyone expected. Then the lawyer read her name. To my granddaughter, I leave the old water tower and the land directly surrounding it. For legal purposes, its value is declared at $1. The room went silent. Then someone laughed. She looked up, certain she had misunderstood. The abandoned tower? Her uncle asked. The one beyond the fields? The lawyer nodded and slid a thin folder across the table. That was her inheritance. Not the farmhouse where she had spent her childhood summers, not her grandfather's antique watch, not even one of the handmade objects he had carefully preserved throughout his life. Only a rusting water tower that had not been used in decades. The family's confusion quickly turned into judgment. One relative called it a useless burden. Another suggested her grandfather had not been thinking clearly. Her cousin joked that the metal might be worth more as scrap than the inheritance itself. She barely heard them. Her attention remained on the folder. Inside were three things: the property deed, an old map of the family land, and a faded photograph of the tower when it was still new. There was no explanation, no instructions, no letter telling her what she was supposed to do with it. But beneath the legal description of the property, her grandfather had added one handwritten sentence: "Do not decide what it is worth until you understand why I kept it." She recognized the handwriting immediately. Her grandfather had always believed that discarded things deserved a second look. He repaired broken furniture, saved old records, and kept objects other people considered useless. But the water tower was different. The town had wanted it removed for years. Its pipes had been disconnected long ago, and the land around it had little practical value. Keeping it had cost him money. Leaving it to her made even less sense. Unless its value had never been practical. That evening she drove to the old property alone. The tower appeared beyond the fields, dark against the last light of sunset. Its metal frame rose above the land like a silent guard. She opened the folder again and studied the photograph. That was when she noticed something she had missed in the lawyer's office. On the back, beneath a layer of faded ink, her grandfather had written a date. Beside it were 4 words. This is where it began. She looked from the photograph to the tower standing in front of her. The $1 inheritance was not an answer. It was the first clue. The next morning, she returned to the property with a local contractor. Up close, the tower looked worse than it had at sunset. Rust covered the support beams. Several bolts were missing, and weeds had grown through the broken fence around its base. The old pipes had been cut away years ago, leaving dark openings in the metal. The contractor walked around the structure, tapping the legs with a hammer and examining the ladder above. Finally, he stepped back. "It may still be standing," he said, "but that doesn't mean it's safe." He explained that repairing the tower could cost more than the surrounding land was worth. Demolishing it would be cheaper, but still expensive enough to turn her $1 inheritance into a serious financial problem. Then he handed her an estimate. The number made her stomach tighten. Her grandfather had not left her something worthless. He had left her something that could cost thousands of dollars simply to remove. The contractor pointed toward the road. "The town has wanted this thing gone for years. If you sign today, I can bring a crew out next week." For a moment, she considered it. Selling the scrap metal would recover part of the cost. The family would stop questioning her. The town would finally get rid of the structure everyone considered dangerous and ugly. All she had to do was sign. Then the wind lifted the corner of the faded photograph in her hand. This is where it began. She looked back at the tower. "Not yet," she said. The contractor shrugged and began gathering his tools. As he moved away from one of the support legs, sunlight struck a small metal plate near the base. It had been hidden beneath dirt, rust, and a curtain of dead vines. She knelt and cleared the surface with her glove. Most of the inscription had disappeared, but one date remained visible. It matched the date written on the back of her grandfather's photograph. Beneath it was a short line she could barely read. "Emergency reserve. Do not drain. She called the contractor back. He examined the plate, then looked toward the disconnected pipes. "That's strange," he said. "According to the town records, this tower was empty long before that date." Her eyes returned to the words carved into the metal. If the official record said the tower was empty, why had someone marked it as an emergency reserve? And why had her grandfather preserved that exact date? The contractor left without her signature. She remained beside the tower, holding the photograph in one hand and brushing rust from the plate with the other. For the first time, the mystery was no longer only about why her grandfather had kept the tower. It was about what the town's records had failed to explain. That evening, she carried the old documents into her grandfather's study. The room had remained almost untouched since his death. His reading glasses still rested beside an open notebook, and the faint smell of tobacco and cedar lingered in the air. She spread the papers across his desk. Most were ordinary: tax receipts, land records, repair invoices, and faded maps of the surrounding farms. But one envelope seemed different. Her name was written across the front in her grandfather's handwriting. Inside was a small brass key and a single sheet of paper. There were no explanations. Only one sentence. "When the tower stops holding water, it begins holding memories." She read the line several times. At first, it made no sense. Then she remembered the metal plate at the base of the tower and the date connected to her grandmother. She searched through the remaining documents more carefully. Beneath an old property map, she found a black and white photograph. It showed the water tower decades earlier, when its paint was still bright and the surrounding fields were green. Her grandfather stood beside it as a young man. Next to him was a woman she immediately recognized as her grandmother, but they were not alone. A group of families stood behind them, carrying suitcases, blankets, and small children. Some looked frightened, others appeared exhausted. On the back of the photograph, her grandfather had written, "The summer the tower saved more than crops." She felt a chill. No one in the family had ever mentioned this photograph. No one had told her that the tower had once been connected to something larger than farming. She examined the brass key again. It was too small for the main door at the tower's base. It looked more like the key to a cabinet or lockbox. At the bottom of the envelope, she found one final clue: a rough drawing of the tower with a small mark near its upper platform. Her grandfather had not wanted her to destroy the tower. He had wanted her to climb it. The next morning, she returned with a flashlight, gloves, and the brass key in her pocket. For years, everyone had looked at the tower and seen only rusting metal. But her grandfather had left behind a path, and now she was ready to follow it. The entrance to the water tower was sealed by a heavy steel door. She pulled at the handle, but it refused to move. Rust had formed around the hinges, and years of dirt had hardened along the frame. After several attempts, she used a crowbar left by the contractor. The door finally opened with a deep metallic groan. A cold, stale smell drifted out. Inside, the tower was darker than she expected. Her flashlight revealed old pipes, broken gauges, and a narrow iron ladder that disappeared into the shadows above. Every sound echoed. The scrape of her boots, the creak of the ladder. Even her breathing seemed too loud. For a moment, she considered turning back. The structure had not been inspected properly, and every step upward caused the metal beneath her hands to tremble. But then she remembered her grandfather's drawing. The mark had been placed near the upper platform. She continued climbing. Halfway up, she found words scratched into one of the beams. Most were too faded to read, but she could still make out several names and dates. One name belonged to her grandmother. The date beside it matched the summer mentioned in the photograph. Her grandfather had not simply preserved the tower. He had preserved evidence. When she finally reached the upper platform, sunlight entered through several holes in the metal walls. Dust floated in the narrow beams of light, covering everything in a pale gray layer. At first, she saw nothing unusual. Then she noticed one section of the floor that looked different. Unlike the surrounding metal, it had been fastened with newer screws. A small keyhole was hidden beneath a strip of peeling paint. She took the brass key from her pocket. It fit perfectly. The lock clicked. She lifted the panel and discovered a narrow compartment built between the floor and the tower's inner wall. Inside was a wooden box wrapped in oilcloth. Her hands trembled as she pulled it free. The box was heavy, but not heavy enough to contain coins or metal. On its lid were her grandfather's initials and a message carved by hand. "This belongs to the one willing to remember." She inserted the key once more, but before opening it, she heard a sound below. Someone else had entered the tower. She froze, one hand still resting on the wooden box. Footsteps echoed below, followed by the sound of someone climbing the iron ladder. "Who's there?" she called. For several seconds, no one answered. Then a familiar voice rose through the darkness. "It's me." Her uncle appeared at the top of the ladder, breathing heavily. His face changed the moment he saw the box. "You found it," he said. She tightened her grip. "You knew this was here?" He looked away. For years the family had believed the water tower was nothing more than an abandoned structure, but her uncle finally admitted that the older generation had known part of the truth. During the summer shown in the photograph, a severe drought had struck the region. Wells dried up. Crops failed. Several nearby families lost nearly everything. But the tower still held water. Her grandfather and grandmother secretly opened the property to those families. They rationed the remaining supply, gave people shelter in the storage building nearby, and helped them survive until aid arrived. The people in the photograph were not workers. They were families the tower had saved. But that was only part of the story. Her uncle explained that one of those families had been accused of stealing money from a local relief fund. The accusation spread quickly, and they were forced to leave town in shame. Her grandmother believed they were innocent. She spent months collecting letters, receipts, and witness statements that could prove what had really happened. Then, before she could reveal the evidence, she became seriously ill. After her death, her grandfather hid everything inside the tower. He feared the people responsible would destroy the documents if they discovered them. "So he kept the tower standing," she whispered. Her uncle nodded. He wasn't protecting the metal, he was protecting the truth. She looked at the box again. The inheritance had never been about money. It had been about finishing something her grandparents had begun decades earlier. Slowly, she lifted the lid. Inside were photographs, handwritten testimonies, old financial records, and a sealed letter addressed to her. On top of everything lay a faded notebook belonging to her grandmother. The first page contained a single sentence. "A family can survive losing its home, but it should never be forced to live beneath a lie." At that moment, she understood why her grandfather had chosen her. He had not left her a ruined tower. He had left her the responsibility to restore a stolen name. She opened the sealed letter first. The paper was thin and yellowed, but her grandfather's handwriting was still clear. He explained that the documents inside the box did more than defend an innocent family. Together, they revealed how the relief money had actually disappeared. Several payment records showed that funds intended for drought victims had been redirected through a private company owned by one of the town's most respected businessmen. Witness statements described false signatures, altered receipts, and families being pressured to remain silent. The accusation against the displaced family had been a distraction. Someone needed a scapegoat, and they had been the easiest target. Her grandmother had uncovered enough evidence to expose the scheme, but before she could take it to the authorities, her health declined. Her grandfather continued collecting records after her death, hoping one day he would have enough proof to clear the family's name. He never did. Some witnesses moved away, others died. A few became too afraid to speak, so he protected what remained. In the final lines of the letter, he wrote, "Truth does not lose its value simply because it arrives late." She sat silently beside the open box. Until that moment, she had believed the priceless secret would be money, jewelry, or some forgotten ownership document. Instead, it was evidence, a collection of fragile papers capable of restoring the reputation of people who had carried shame for generations. Her uncle warned her that revealing the documents could reopen old conflicts. The businessman named in the records had died years ago, but his family still held influence in town. Some people would deny everything. Others would claim the past should remain buried. But she could no longer see the tower as an old piece of metal. It had once stored water that kept families alive. Later, it stored the truth that protected their dignity. The tower had served the same purpose twice. It preserved what people needed most. She carefully photographed every document and contacted a local historian, an attorney, and the surviving descendants of the accused family. The response came 2 days later. A woman named Elena called her. Her voice trembled as she explained that her grandfather had spent his entire life insisting he had been falsely accused. No one outside the family had ever believed him. Then Elena asked the question that changed everything. "Do you really have proof?" She looked at the wooden box. "Yes," she said. "I think my grandparents saved it for you." The historian arrived at the tower 3 days later. She spent hours examining the photographs, letters, payment records, and handwritten testimonies. At first, she said very little. She simply compared dates, studied signatures, and checked the names against documents preserved in the town archive. By sunset, her expression had changed. "These records appear to be genuine," she said, "and they match several gaps in the official history." The missing relief payments had always been explained as accounting errors. The accused family had been blamed largely because one witness claimed to have seen their eldest son near the relief office. But the documents in the box told a different story. One receipt showed that the missing money had been transferred before the young man ever entered the building. Another letter revealed that the witness had worked for the businessman whose company received the funds. For decades, the town had accepted the easiest version of the story. Now that version was beginning to collapse. Word spread quickly. The same neighbors who had called the tower an eyesore began appearing at the edge of the property. Some wanted to see the evidence, others simply stood in silence, staring at the structure they had demanded be destroyed. Her relatives also returned. The uncle who had advised her to sell the land apologized for doubting her grandfather. A cousin who had joked about the $1 inheritance offered to help repair the fence. But not everyone welcomed the discovery. The businessman's descendants publicly questioned the documents. They accused her of damaging their family's reputation with an old story that could no longer be proven in court. For a moment, the pressure made her hesitate. Then Elena arrived with her mother and 2 boxes of family records. Inside were letters written by Elena's grandfather after he had been forced to leave town. His descriptions of the drought, the missing money, and her grandparents' efforts matched the documents from the tower. The 2 collections supported each other. At a public meeting the following week, the historian presented the findings. No one celebrated. There was only a long, uncomfortable silence as the town confronted what it had chosen to believe. Then, an elderly man stood. As a child, he had received water from the tower during the drought. "We laughed at that old structure," he said, "but it remembered the truth better than we did." One by one, others lowered their eyes. The tower had not changed. The people looking at it had. After the public meeting, the town council voted to delay the demolition order. For the first time in decades, people no longer saw the water tower as a danger that needed to be removed. They saw it as a witness. But saving it would not be easy. An engineer inspected the structure and confirmed that several supports had weakened. The ladder needed replacement, the roof had leaks, and the interior was unsafe for visitors. The repair estimate was far beyond what she could afford. For several days, she considered giving up. The truth had already been revealed. The accused family's name had begun to be cleared. Perhaps the tower had completed its purpose. Then Elena visited the property. She stood beneath the rusted structure and placed one hand on a support beam. "My grandfather died believing this town had forgotten him," she said. "This tower proves someone remembered." That sentence changed the decision. Instead of selling the land, she announced a plan to restore the tower and turn the surrounding property into a small historical site. She wanted the place to tell the complete story, not only of the missing relief money, but of the drought, the families who survived, and the people who risked their reputations to help them. At first, the plan seemed impossible. Then support began arriving from unexpected places. A local construction company offered materials at cost, retired workers volunteered their time, students helped clean the grounds and digitize the documents, Families who had received water from the tower donated photographs and personal stories. Even her cousin, who had once mocked the inheritance, spent weekends repairing the old fence. The restoration took months. The tower's original shape was preserved, but damaged metal was reinforced. A safe viewing platform was built near the base, while the hidden compartment remained sealed behind glass. The wooden box, her grandmother's notebook, and copies of the records became the center of a small exhibit. On opening day, Elena's family returned to the town their ancestors had been forced to leave. There were no grand speeches. Instead, Elena placed a framed photograph beside the tower, the same image of the families gathered during the drought. Below it was a simple plaque. Water preserved their lives. Truth restored their names. As visitors walked through the site, she stood back and looked at the tower. It was still old. It was still marked by rust and time, but it was no longer forgotten. Her grandfather's strange inheritance had become a place where an entire community could finally remember together. The night after the opening, she returned to the tower alone. The visitors were gone. The lights around the exhibit had been turned off, and the property was quiet again. For the first time in months, there were no questions to answer, no repairs to manage, and no documents left to organize. There was only the tower. She sat beneath it with her grandfather's letter in her hands. At the beginning, she had believed he had left her a burden. Then she thought he had left her a mystery. Later, she believed he had left her evidence. But now she understood that the real gift was something else. He had left her a choice. She could have sold the land. She could have accepted the town's version of the past. She could have opened the box, read the documents, and decided that the truth was too old to matter. Instead, he had trusted her to look closer. Her grandfather had spent his life protecting a promise that began with her grandmother, that people should not be forgotten simply because the truth was inconvenient. The water tower had carried that promise through decades of silence. Its value had never been in the steel. It had never been in the land beneath it. It had never even been in the secret compartment. Its value came from what it asked of the person who inherited it: courage to question what everyone else accepted, patience to examine what others ignored, and compassion for people she had never met. She opened the letter again and read the final paragraph. Her grandfather wrote that memory was not the same as living in the past. Memory was a responsibility. It allowed one generation to correct what another had failed to do. At the bottom of the page, he had added one final sentence: "I left you the tower because I knew you would not mistake silence for emptiness." Her eyes filled with tears. For years, she had wondered whether her grandfather truly understood her, her stubbornness, her curiosity, her refusal to let unanswered questions disappear. Now she had her answer. The strange inheritance was not a test of whether she could discover something valuable. It was proof that he already knew her value. She looked up at the tower, dark against the night sky. For the first time, she no longer saw a monument to his death. She saw a final conversation between them. And at last, she understood what he had been trying to say. Years later, the water tower still stood at the edge of the old family property. Its steel had been reinforced, but the marks of age remained visible. The town had chosen not to hide the rust or replace every weathered panel. Those scars had become part of the story. The small historical site grew slowly. More families brought letters, photographs, and memories connected to the drought. Students came to study the records. Visitors stopped beneath the tower to read the names of those who had once gathered there for water. The town also officially corrected its historical archive. The family that had been accused was publicly cleared, and the missing relief funds were recorded as part of a long-hidden fraud. No court could undo the years of shame. No apology could return the lives that had been shaped by the lie. But the truth was no longer buried. She continued caring for the tower, though she never called herself its owner. She preferred another word: guardian. The tower belonged to everyone whose story had survived inside it. On the anniversary of the site's opening, she found a young girl standing near the exhibit, staring at the old wooden box. "Was there treasure inside?" the girl asked. She smiled. "Yes," she answered. but not the kind people usually expect. She explained that the box had contained papers capable of restoring a family's name. It had also revealed the courage of two people who protected the truth when silence would have been easier. The girl looked up at the tower. So the tower was priceless? She paused before answering. The tower was only valuable because someone chose to remember what it held. That evening, after the visitors left, she walked to the base of the structure and placed her hand against the cool steel. She thought of her grandfather. He had left her something worth $1 on paper, but its true value could never be measured in money. The tower had restored a family's dignity. It had forced a town to face its past. It had turned strangers into a community of witnesses. Most importantly, it had taught her that inheritance was not always something a person could sell or keep. Sometimes, inheritance was a responsibility passed from one generation to the next. Above her, the water tower stood quietly against the fading sky. It no longer held water. It no longer hid a secret, but it still held something priceless. The memory of people who had nearly been forgotten, and the promise that they never would be again.